Hey guys, how you going? My name is Dom and today we'll be creating a placeholder image generator using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so this is just a fun little project to demonstrate how you can do something like this using JavaScript and also the HTML5 Canvas. Okay, so right here we can see we have the finished result. We've got a couple of input fields right up here and we can enter in the width and height for the image. So for example, I can press generate on 400 by 300 and we get the preview right down here, and we can of course right click and save or copy, whatever it might be, and we can also copy and paste this right here. It's a data URL, and essentially if you put this URL right here into an HTML image tag, you can then have that image right here used in the browser or the web page you're building. So this right here acts just like a regular source for an image tag. Okay, so let's go inside this tab right here and begin from scratch to of course create what we just saw. So going inside the text editor, we can see I've got this main index HTML file, and I've also linked up an empty CSS and empty JavaScript file right here, which of course, as we can see, they are in fact empty. So the first step here is going to be to head inside the JavaScript and create a function for generating that image right there. So in the first line here, I'm going to make a new function called create placeholder and then canvas. Okay, so this right here is going to take through a width and a height. So the purpose of this function right here is to give us a new HTML5 Canvas HTML element. Okay, so with that being said, we can go right up here and we can add some JS doc just for demonstration purposes. We can just say as the first parameter, we can make this a number, and the second one can be a number also. Now, like I said, this one is going to return. So we can say returns right down here, and we can say returns then pass through here HTML canvas element right inside there. Okay, we can also just say, for example, creates a HTML canvas element of the given size. Okay, so the first line of this function right here is going to be to actually create that element. Okay, so going down here, we can say const element is equal to document.createElement. We can pass in here the tag name. Of course, it's going to be canvas right inside here. We can then get a reference to the 2D context of the canvas. So we can say const context is equal to element. Okay, so element dot get context, and then of course pass through here 2D. So we're going to be drawing two main things: the actual rectangular background of the gray and also the text in the center. So with that being said, the first thing to do is going to be to set the width and height of the canvas. So we can say element.width is equal to width right there from the actual parameter list. Then we can say element.height is equal to, of course, this time being the height. So now we're going to do one simple drawing. So we're going to be actually placing the background color. So to achieve that, we can simply say context.fill style. So of course, having this fill style property is going to change the fill color of the next command or method we call, which of course is going to be to actually draw the rectangle. So we can say right inside here, hash and then D. So just a very light gray. Okay. Then we can say context.fill rect. Okay. So I might put an equal sign right inside here. That'll definitely help it work. And now we can say context.fill rect, then pass through here a couple of arguments. So this is going to be the X and Y for where the rectangle we're going to draw is going to begin. So in this case right here, we want this rectangle, this gray rectangle, to take up the entire space of the canvas. Okay, so we're going to begin drawing at the topmost left corner, so 0, 0, and then for the width, we're going to pass through the entire width of the canvas, and the same goes for the height. So we can say width right here, then we can say height, just like that. Now, it might be more accurate to actually pass through element.width and then element.height, even though in this case right here, they're going to be the exact same, but like I said, it's probably a bit more accurate. Okay, Cool. So now we can simply return the element which we created. So of course, right inside here, we've created an HTML element on this line, but it isn't actually on the page just yet. So to preview our work here, we're going to add the element to the actual page. So going down here on the first line outside of the function, we can just say, for example, document.body.append child, then of course pass through here the element. So now saving this and going inside the browser, we can see we have nothing. So let's figure out why. So I think it might be the case of not actually calling the function. So we're going to append child, and then we're going to pass through here and call the function of create placeholder canvas. So of course we can pass through here, for example, something like 300 for the width and then 200 for the height. So now saving this and trying again, we can see we get the gray rectangle right there. Now I might just increase the background color just for visibility purposes. So let's go back inside here and make this something like a much darker gray. We can do AAA. Saving this, and now we can see, of course, we get that darker background just like that. So I think I might have actually put an extra A here. Let's try again, 6 A's, and now we get that right there. So how do we add in the actual text, which says, of course, the width and height specified? So for this, let's go back inside here. We can just place a comment on top of this one right here. We can just say fill in the background, and now we can have a separate block of code here for place the text. Okay, so when it comes to the text, it's going to work in a very similar way. Of course, we're going to be using the 2D context. So we're going to say as a first line here, context.font. So we're going to be setting the font for the upcoming text drawing command. So the font is going to simply be bold, then 30 pixels, and then we're going to say sans serif as the font family. We can then say context.fill style and set the fill style this time from this AAA to be something like, let's do a dark gray. We can do 333. Okay, and then we can say context.text align. We can make this center, and that is for the horizontal centering. And then we can say, once again, context, this time we can say text baseline. So we can set the baseline of the text to be middle. Okay, so now that is basically going to ensure that the text we insert is going to be in the absolute center of where we actually set the positioning of the text. Okay, so to actually fill the text and make it appear, we can then say context.fill text, then pass through here. We need to pass through the actual text of the text drawing. Okay, so this needs to be something like 200x300. Okay, so for the text, we can just say, using right here a JavaScript template string, we can pass through here using $ and then curly brackets, and also the backticks right inside here. We can pass through width. Okay, then we can say x. Then once again, using the $ and then curly brackets, we can pass through here height. So this basically is going to grab the width and heights. We're going to say, in this case right here, 300 times 200. So of course, these $ and this curly bracket is going to be replaced by the actual value, in this case 300 by 200. And then we can specify the positioning of the actual text. So in this case, like I said, it's going to be in the complete center. So to achieve the center of the whole rectangle, we simply say element.width divided by 2, then element.height divided by 2 as the last argument right there. So now, saving this and going inside the browser, we can now see we have the text printed right there. Okay, so now we've basically created this function, and this is going to be the core part of today's video. So now it's going to be all about essentially hooking up the simple user interface to, of course, show and display this image whenever the user inputs their numbers. So let's go back inside here, and we can now begin on the actual HTML. So for the HTML, I might just quickly remove this line because now it is no longer needed. So now we can save this and only have the function in the JavaScript. So moving on to the index HTML, it's going to have a couple of elements right here. So the first one is going to be the title. We can just say placeholder image generator. Okay, and then we can have an H3, and this H3 is just going to be something like dimensions for the dimensions input. Then we can just have right down here the data URL title, and then we can have the preview title. So of course, 3 of those H3 tags right there. So saving this is going to give us something like this in the browser. So now let's actually place those input fields. So going back inside here, under dimensions, we can say input with a type of number just inside here, and then we can give this an ID, and the ID is just going to simply be input and then width. We can also give this a class of simply just input, and also we may as well give this a default value of something like 400. Let's do the exact same thing for the height. We can say input, then we can say height with a default of 300 instead. And now inside here we can just put an X between those two input fields, and then lastly we can have the actual button right here with a type of button, and of course inside here we can just say generate, just like this. And that is all for the dimensions title. Saving this will give us something like this in the browser. Okay, so moving on to the data URL component. For this one, we can simply have once again a new input field. This one is going to have a class of input once again with an ID of input data URL, just like this. So now we can place a placeholder, and the placeholder is just going to say please generate a placeholder image. So of course in this case right here, placeholder is just the actual name of the attribute which shows the grey text whenever the user has no input. Okay, we can also say right inside here read only, that way the user can't enter in their own input. Of course this input field is going to be generated by the code which we wrote right inside here. So now saving this will give us something like this in the browser. Okay, so the last step here is going to be to of course include the actual image tag for the preview. So going back inside here, let's go down under the preview title, and we can just say a new image tag right here with an ID of image preview, and this one is going to have the alt text of something like preview image. And since the source of this image tag is going to be generated by the JavaScript, we can simply remove this as the default and of course add it in dynamically with the JS code later on. And we can just save this now and go back inside the browser, and of course we have this right here. So let's apply some very basic CSS to make this look a little bit better. So going inside the CSS right inside here, we can firstly just target the main HTML body. We can just say a font family of sans serif, just like this. We can also target each one of our input fields. So we can say class of input, then we can say a height of 30px and a box sizing of border box. Essentially, this box sizing is going to make sure that the actual padding of the input field does not affect the height, which we specified right here. Okay, we can also target the specific input width and input height elements, and for these two, the width and height, we can say a width of 100px. Of course, the numbers are going to be quite small, so want to make sure that the actual width here isn't too large. So saving this right here will give us this in the browser. Okay, so moving on to the data URL input, we can just say ID of input data URL, and for this one we can just say a width of 100%, okay, and then a max width of 600px. So basically it's going to try to fit the entire width of the page, but it's going to max out at 600px. This way, if I go inside here, I can show you, we can see if I was to resize the browser, it's going to resize alongside it right here if it gets below 600 pixels in width. Okay, so let's move on to the last step here. That is going to be the preview image. So going back inside here, we can target image preview, and this one we can just say a width of 100% right inside here. We're going to be adding an inline style through the JavaScript very shortly, but for now, let's save this, and of course we get something like this. Not much has changed just for now. So let's move on to the JavaScript to of course tie all of this stuff together. So going back inside the JS file right inside here, we're going to firstly, above the function which we defined, we can firstly get a reference to all of those HTML elements which we just created. So we can say const input width is equal to document.getElementById, then of course pass through here input width. Let's do the exact same thing for the input height. So of course INPUTHIGHT for input height. Then we can also once again just do the exact same thing for the input data URL. And lastly, we have, of course, the image preview just like this. So now, of course, we've got a reference to each one of our HTML elements right inside here in the JavaScript. So the next step is going to be to do something when the user clicks on the generate button. Okay, so let's go inside here. We're going to simply just say on line 6, we can say document.getElementById. Then of course pass through here the button generate ID. So now we can just say .add event listener. Then of course pass through here the click listener. So of course when the button gets clicked on, we're going to do something. So of course this function right inside here is going to run, and this function is going to firstly define a maximum side length for the images. So for example, we can say const min side length. So I'm meant to say minimum. So this right here is a minimum side length of something like 200 px. So of course, if the user wants to go less than 200 px, then we're just going to show an error message. So speaking of that error message, let's define a few conditions for validation. So we can say validation right up here. And we can say essentially, we're going to check if the user has actually inputted a valid number, and also if those numbers are less than 200 for the minimum side length. So we can say if right inside here, and we can expand this to be multiple lines. So we're going to specify multiple conditions. We're going to say if is not a number. So basically if input width dot value. So basically if the value of the input field for the width is not a number, or the input height is not a number, okay? Or we can say input width dot value is less than min side length, or the input height dot value is less than the minimum side length. So any of these conditions right here, if they are true, then we're going to show an error message. So we're going to say alert, please enter a valid image size. The minimum length is, then we can pass through here basically 200 px, but of course we're using a hard-coded number for this actual value. So let's transform this string into a JavaScript template string once again using the backticks right up here. And now we can simply pass through here, replace this 200 with the $, then the curly brackets. We can say min side length right inside here. So now let's save this. Let's go back inside the browser and let's test out the actual validation. So we can put, for example, 150 inside here. If I press generate, we can see we get nothing. Let's figure out why once again. So apparently the button generate does not exist. So let's add an ID to this button. We're going to say ID and call this button generate right inside here. Let's save this and try again. Back inside here, then press 150, press generate, and now we get please enter a valid image size. The minimum length is of course 200 px right there. So now we have all of this right here. So to essentially stop this function from running and proceeding, we can simply say return right down here, and now of course none of the code from this point onwards is going to run. So basically it's going to stop the execution. So if everything is all good, we can of course write some code down here to continue with the preview generation. So the first step here is going to be to get a reference to the newly created canvas element. So we can say const canvas element is equal to create placeholder canvas, then pass through here into our function the input width dot value, then input height dot value. Of course, grabbing the user input right there. We can then grab the data URL which gets created by the canvas. So we can say const data URL is equal to canvas element dot to data URL, and this one is going to create a PNG data URL for the actual image contents, and that of course refers to this right here like we saw in the example. So that being said, there's going to be a couple more things to do. The first one is going to be to simply set the data URL inside that data URL input field. So we can simply say input data URL dot value is equal to data URL. We can then say for the image preview, we can specify the source. We can say image preview dot source is equal to the data URL. Then we can say image preview dot style dot display is equal to block. Now, the reason for setting the display property on the image preview to block is because by default we don't want the image right here to be displayed. So let's make this preview image be hidden by default by going back inside the HTML, and we can simply just say right down here style, then display, and make this none. So now by default, if I save, we can see the image is no longer there and we don't get that broken image logo. Okay, so now the last step here is going to be to simply change the max width of the image, but first I want to show you why we're going to do that. So with that being said, let's generate right here. As we can see, we get the data URL inside there, we have the preview image, and we can see here that it's actually a little bit blurry. Okay, so just so you guys can see, we can also note that the source of the image tag right here is set to, of course, the data URL, and that of course is giving us that image. So going back to this blurry image right here, of course, it's blurry because the image tag is set to 100% width by the CSS. So how do we make it so essentially we want the image to be full width but not bigger than the actual size? In this case, of course, 400. So going back inside here, we can set the image preview dot style dot maximum width. So dot max width, set the max width to be the actual width of the canvas. So once again, using the template strings, we can pass through here the input width dot value, then place px at the end of that. So now saving this right here, going back inside the browser. Now, if I was to generate, we can see it is now only a maximum of 400 px right there. If I was to resize to be smaller, it's going to shrink as the window resizes, just like the input field right up here. So that is how to generate, or sorry, should I say create, a placeholder image generator using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I'll leave the link to the code for this in the description below for you to download. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.